Sue Reverby, hello.
Why don't we get started? Yeah, okay. Hi, my name is Maris Kreisman and I run events and marketing at McNally Jackson. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for our store. If you go to McNallyJackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming days and weeks. I'm adding more every day, so please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. I'll post a link to buy Conspiracy in the Streets from our website into the chat. And I will also post a link to our events fund because we would really appreciate any donations you can spare. And now I will stop begging and we will celebrate the relaunch of John Wiener's Conspiracy in the Streets, the extraordinary trial of the Chicago 7, which is now a major motion picture. John Wiener is a contributing editor to The Nation and is host and producer of Start Making Sense, the Nation's weekly podcast. An emeritus professor of US history at UC Irvine, he is the author of Give Me Some Truth, Come Together, Historians in Trouble, and most recently, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s with Mike Davis. He lives in LA. And in conversation with John, we have Tony Scott. As a child, A.O. Scott dreamed of being a rock critic. After dropping out of graduate school, he worked as a book critic and accidentally became a film critic when the New York Times hired him in 2000. Doubling down on the bizarre decision, the paper named him chief film critic in 2004, a title he currently shares with Manohla Dargis. Mr. Scott has continued to dabble in literary criticism for the Book Review and occasionally for other publications, and writes for the Times Magazine whenever he can. He also makes frequent appearances on radio and television, especially during Oscar season. Welcome.
Okay. So should I start?
Sure.
I have a question for Tony. So this is we have an Aaron Sorkin film about real events. I wrote a book about the real events, and lots of people ask me, did this really happen? Did that really happen? But the truth is, the most boring thing a historian can say about a movie is it's not accurate. But there still is this problem when you're making a movie about real events and you have the real names of the people on the characters. We know Aaron Sorkin is going to turn it into a kind of Aaron Sorkin production, but what are the rules here? What should we expect? What would make this good, or what would make this not so good?
Well, that's the question I grapple with, which is not is it accurate, but is it any good? I agree with you. I've gotten into many fights with historians over the years about movies that failed to be, a faithful record of historical events down to the smallest detail. And there's always an interesting ongoing argument about what is the responsibility of filmmakers or novelists or other storytellers when they're dealing with real material. I mean, I tend to think that they have whatever latitude they want, and the test is, do they tell a good story? Do they tell an interesting story? Do they tell a story that has some feeling of truth to it, whether or not it's literally accurate? And that's a harder question to determine. I mean, this is I found this movie very strange, not entirely unenjoyable, but I thought some of the choices were curious. For one thing, just looking at your book and looking at the names of the people who testified in the trial, it seemed like a huge missed opportunity. That, I mean, maybe it was too much work to identify these people, and maybe nobody knows anymore who Norman Mailer or Allen Ginsberg or Judy Collins or, you know, all of these people, Timothy Leary. I mean, it's an incredible list of the celebrities of the time who were caught up in this movement and this moment. And given that part of what the movie is about, part of what the argument between Abbie Hoffman and Tom Hayden is about, is the role of celebrity and popular culture and spectacle in political change. So I thought to narrow it down was a strange choice. Another thing, which is something that I'm not proud of complaining about, but I find often bothers me, is the habitual casting of British actors in American roles. So, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary here. You have Sasha Baron Cohen as Abbie Hoffman. You have Mark Rylance as William Kunstler, Mark Strong as Jerry Rubin, Eddie Redmayne as Tom Hayden. And you sort of think, I don't know, were there no Americans who could do the job? But I don't necessarily want to air that kind of, you know, nationalist sentiment here. But I guess in a way, my question, to turn it back to you, I mean, I found the story very interesting in some regards and very frustrating in others. The thing that frustrated me probably the most was the way that it was, as you say, turned into this Aaron Sorkin story, where the thing that always tends to happen, whether it's on The West Wing or in any of his films, is that you very often have two people, usually two men, in the kind of antagonistic relationship to each other, who end up seeing things from each other's point of view. And his whole idea, in a way, of politics and of drama is that. So you have Tom Hayden and Abbie Hoffman fighting, and then coming to sort of recognize that they have more in common. You have a subplot that works that way, involving the prosecuting attorney, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and where he's on the other side of the conspirators, but you have the sense that his sense of decency and fair play and his Americanness and their Americanness can kind of go together. And watching that story, maybe just watching that story in 2020, I just didn't buy that story. So I guess what I want to ask you as a historian is what's kind of the status of the truth of that story? Is that it, and does that seem to you an interesting and authentic, whether or not it's strictly accurate, story to be telling about the Chicago 7?
Well, let's start out with the fact that, according to Rotten Tomatoes, this is the most popular movie in America right now. It has a 93% positive rating, something almost unheard of in the annals of film criticism. And something like more than 160 critics have written about this film. So go figure. I think, you know, it has, your question leads me to the happy ending. It has a happy ending. Soaring music, cheering crowd in the courtroom when Tom Hayden reads the list of names of the Americans killed in the war. Now, I have a particular pet peeve about this happy ending. And it's not just that it didn't happen that way. I mean, what actually happened was Dave Dellinger did try to read a list of names, but it was at the beginning of the trial, not at the end. It wasn't a very big deal. It was stopped right away, no cheering. So an event was shifted from the beginning to the end. The character reading the names was shifted. I think that's okay. But the point of reading the names, the reason that this is a happy ending is exactly what you say about it shows the transformation of Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden, as you say, has been involved throughout the plot in this conflict with Abbie Hoffman. Abbie Hoffman is for cultural revolution. That is made very clear to us. He says it several times. He's for ridiculing the judge, delegitimizing the system, using humor to undermine the sanctity of the court. Tom Hayden sort of speaks with what's actually the voice of Aaron Sorkin, that liberal electoral politics are what count in America. There's a line where Tom tells Abbie, if you can't win elections, you can't accomplish anything. Now, who they were going to vote for in 1968 when Hubert Humphrey was running against Richard Nixon, the war party against the Republicans, this is, Aaron Sorkin doesn't really try to figure that out, but this is the debate, kind of liberal electoral politics versus cultural revolution. And in that finale, Judge Hoffman, the outrageous, the intolerable, the unjust judge, tells Tom Hayden, young man, you could go far if you just follow the rules here. And if you treat this process with respect, I'll look favorably on you in sentencing. Do you understand me, sir? And Tom says, I understand you want me to be respectful. And then there's a Sorkin moment of what's going to happen. And then Tom defies the judge and he reads the names, which is against the rules. The happy ending is that Tom Hayden has learned to defy unjust authority. And so we all cheer, the music swells up, and we go home feeling good. But of course, that's ridiculous. The reason Tom Hayden was on trial was because he had defied unjust authority. He'd been doing it for 10 years. He'd been to North Vietnam. He was, a famous person. So I think just in terms of what we know about the movie, what they're charged with, I don't think it's a very successful ending, even though I was cheering too at the end. Yeah, read those names. But even in the terms that we know why Tom Hayden is on trial, I don't think it's a very convincing ending, even though it's a rousing one and everybody seems to like it. So what are what's the standings? What are the requirements and of a happy ending in Sorkin land?
Well, I mean, I think it is supposed to arouse that specific emotion in you that you describe of feeling that a conflict, someone has taken a stand, that some value of justice and nobility is being articulated, and that no one can argue. It's also a moment where the argument stops. Here we are, we're reading the names of American soldiers killed in Vietnam. Everyone in that courtroom, the judge, the lawyers, is going to be moved by that and is going to feel, some version of the same thing. And that I think always with Sorkin is the answer to polarization and to conflict, is that kind of, the recognition, and in a way the recognition of the heroism, the in this case spurious heroism of Tom Hayden, and the beautiful sort of like dialectical movement of where Abbie Hoffman, who seems like the clown throughout it all, turns out to be the conscience of it, and pulls Tom Hayden to sort of to realize his better nature. I mean, all of this, like I felt like watching it. I'm a little bit of a '60s nerd, so I know some things about this, even though or maybe just because I didn't live through it, so I was kind of a little bit obsessed with it. But I don't think you have to know very enough just to know in your gut that this is bogus. To just know that it didn't happen that way. And I guess the thing that I wondered about is like, okay, you tell this story and you're clearly telling this story. I mean, Sorkin worked on this for a long time, so it's not as if he was thinking, this movie is going to come out in 2020 in the middle of, police violence and demonstrations, right, and a law and order candidate blaming disorder on outside agitators and far leftists. I mean, he in a way lucked out in this yes, moment. But at the same time, there's also something I found kind of dissonant about watching it now. Because it sort of is saying, well, right, you say it's a happy ending. It's all going to be all right. We're all going to kind of, even if we don't agree, we're going to shake hands. We're going to respect each other. We're going to. If our institutions are in trouble, our values will get us through. I don't know how persuasive I can.
Yeah. Well, what some people have told me is, isn't it remarkable how much Judge Hoffman is like our president, Donald Trump? Well, Not really. I mean, it's kind of a stretch, but he says, young man, no one before has ever accused me of being prejudiced against the underprivileged. This is after he has ordered Bobby Seale to be bound and gagged in the courtroom. And Trump does say, I've done more for the Black people than anybody since Abraham Lincoln. So maybe a little bit there. But the people who see the contemporary resonance see, well, standing up to the judge is the judge is the Trump figure, and even the prosecutors are sort of embarrassed and chagrined about what to do about the presence of this kind of demented figure in their midst. Again, I think that's kind of a stretch, but that's what people have told me.
There was an interesting, I want to actually get into just a minute into the history, because there was an interesting sort of subplot that I thought was fascinating. That may just having been looking at your book may have actually a little more grounding in reality than I had realized when I was watching the movie, which is it begins with John Mitchell, the new Attorney General, kind of settling a score with the Johnson administration and deciding to prosecute these people under the Rap Brown law, and then that subplot kind of bears out in the appearance, the sort of surprise appearance of Michael Keaton, the original Batman, showing up as Ramsey Clark. So this was a fascinating kind of, like, if you want, sort of deep state history of the conspiracy theory. I mean, what's the story there?
Well, I don't know of any source that says that John Mitchell did this in a vendetta against his predecessor. It's possible, but I don't know that that's a fact. The Ramsey Clark, the scene where Tom and Kunstler go to Ramsey Clark's house, and there's two Justice Department officials there to try to talk him out of accepting their invitation to testify in the trial. That is straight out of Tom Hayden's memoir called Reunion. Except that it wasn't Kunstler who went; it was his partner who went. That, again, that's permissible. The Sorkinizing of this is that Ramsey Clark greets them by saying, "How come it took you guys so long to get here?" That's not at all what the real former Attorney General said to Tom Hayden. He just said, "I'll accept your invitation and I'll tell the truth," is what Tom has him saying. And indeed, it is one of the most amazing parts of this trial that Ramsey Clark appears in the courtroom. He's prepared to testify that the previous administration did not find any basis for bringing an indictment against these people. They had not conspired. They had not incited a riot. And Judge Hoffman refuses to allow the jury to hear this testimony. Indeed, refuses to allow the jury even that Ramsey Clark, was in the courtroom and prepared to testify. And the New York Times then wrote an editorial and said, "This is one of the low points in the entire history of American justice." We don't get that kind of outside perspective from Sorkin. He leaves it to us to feel the outrage over this. But Sorkin knew how to make that scene work. And thank you for reminding us that this was Batman who showed up.
I mean, Michael Keaton is just one of my favorite actors to show, because he does often do this where he shows up. And I hadn't known he was in it. Actually, I hadn't seen him in the opening titles. So when he showed up, I just, it just kind of pops a little bit, because he's so kind of, wily and cranky and fun to watch.
Well, in a lot of ways, the star of this movie is Sasha Baron Cohen. He is at his best. I think it's his best thing he's ever done. Abbie Hoffman is actually a better version of the Sasha Baron Cohen personae. He's not as over the top or as nutty. He's got some real political ideas. And Sacha Baron Cohen understands this very well. I mean, in his interviews, he speaks with total admiration for Abbie Hoffman. It says Abbie Hoffman was the smartest person in that room. He understood how America works, and he is so kind of lovable as a character, the Abbie character played by Sacha Baron Cohen, and so charismatic. You know, Tom Hayden is not lovable and charismatic in this movie, and really all the other defendants are similarly kind of pushed into the background, with the exception of Bobby Seale, who has his one tremendous scene. You know, they're mentioning Sacha Baron Cohen as a potential nominee for Best Actor. This is, somebody said to me, "Who's mentioning him?" And I said, "Well, the great mentioner is who's mentioning him. I mean, who does the mentioning? It's the mentioner." It's
the publicists in the employ of Netflix. But I think you make a very good point about the kind of the connection between Hoffman and Cohen, because in a way you could see it, especially, I mean, I have not seen the second Borat movie, but Sacha Baron Cohen, I mean, in a way, Abbie Hoffman, to the extent that he was a kind of a political comedian as well as a political activist, and he's shown in this in the film, you know, basically doing stand-up to help raise money for the defense. But he's kind of an ancestor of Sacha Baron Cohen, using kind of satire and outrageousness and dressing up in costumes and kind of being a sort of you know, kind of aesthetic anarchist in the service of a political vision. I mean, I didn't think he quite had that Boston or Brookline accent. You know, it's a hard one. It's a hard one. But I felt like maybe a few more rounds of dialect coaching. But he did make the case for, because I think that Hoffman, I feel like maybe you can say more about this. Just I feel like that Hoffman has been, his stock has maybe fallen a little bit. I mean, I feel like he's not necessarily looked back on with great sort of admiration or even taken seriously. I mean, there's a little bit, I think, in the narrative of the 60s that I grew up learning, that sort of, you know, it was the Yippies who went too far and they were too self-indulgent, and he and Rubin were in some way kind of unserious and kind of messed it up. And well, it's interesting that this movie rehabilitates him so much.
Yeah. I think my understanding is they always wanted Sacha Baron Cohen for this role, going back to the very beginning in 2009 or whenever it was that Steven Spielberg first thought of doing this. I mean, who would have thought? The idea came from Steven Spielberg. He called up Aaron Sorkin and said, "You have to come over to my house. I have a great idea. Let's make a movie about the trial of the Chicago 7." And Aaron Sorkin didn't know what he was talking about, but said, "Oh, sure, that's a great idea." And then went home and called his parents and said, "What was the trial of the Chicago 7?" But
how old is Aaron Sorkin?
There was a real conflict.
Sorry.
There was a real conflict between Tom and Rennie and Davis and Dave Dellinger and Abbie and Jerry. Tom was sort of contemptuous of Abbie, is the truth. They considered Abbie and Jerry to be not organizers. Rennie Davis organized hundreds of thousands of people to come to huge anti-war mobilizations. I mean, while the trial was going, in November of '69 was Vietnam Moratorium Day in Washington, D.C., and 250,000 people showed up for that. I mean, Abbie and Jerry never had the ability to organize people. They had the ability to get on TV with their outrageous stunts, like the idea of levitating the Pentagon, which still makes everyone smile. Although, Tom, again, this was the March on the Pentagon in 1967. Tom was very critical of that. That's the wrong messaging. You know, we shouldn't say we're going to Washington to levitate the Pentagon. We're going to Washington to confront the war makers. So the movie is onto something in saying there are very two different conceptions of politics at play here. They just get Tom's all wrong. They think Tom is an advocate of elections and liberal voting. But 10 years later, 8 years later, Tom was running for office as a Democrat. He got elected to the state legislature. And in fact, if Bobby Kennedy had not been assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in June of 1968, Tom probably would have campaigned for Bobby Kennedy, because Bobby Kennedy was a kind of last liberal hope of bringing together the white working class with people of color around a progressive platform that included ending the war. But once Bobby Kennedy was gone, Tom was a radical, a revolutionary. He was not for mainstream Democratic politics, and he was not for Yippie politics either.
I mean, he had coined the phrase from, or was popularizing the phrase from protest to resistance at exactly this time, which doesn't suggest a sort of, a square button down electoral strategy. I wanted to also ask you about, because there's the other, I mean, you mentioned Bobby Seale, and who was, not part of the Chicago 7, and but the sub story that deals with Bobby Seale and also with Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago, and who was killed during the course of the trial. How did you think the movie handled that, and handled the kind of the thread of race and anti-racist and Black militant politics that was part of this movement, but in a somewhat maybe vexed relationship with it by now? Yeah.
Well, Yahya Abdul Mateen II, whose work I did not know, I'd not seen his other movies or his TV show. I thought he was a really good Bobby Seale. He had the right combination of kind of that internal sense of power and authority, and able to speak, with outrage, but then also able to hold it in. And the dramatizing the courtroom, he repeatedly demands, first of all, the right to counsel. His lawyer, Charles Gary, has had gallbladder surgery in San Francisco and is in the hospital, applied to postpone the trial, was denied. When the judge rejects that, Bobby Seale demands the right to represent himself. All this is, the movie makes it clear this is all totally legitimate. It's what American law provides to every accused person. And then the scene where Bobby Seale is bound and gagged, I think, is a very powerful thing in the movie. In fact, in quote, real life, it went on for 4 days. He was able to shout through his gag, continuing to demand his right to represent himself. So the judge kept ordering the marshals to tie him up tighter and bind his gag tighter, and it became more and more horrifying. The other thing Aaron Sorkin decided to do with those scenes, aside from condensing it to one single scene, was he makes the room completely silent when Bobby Seale is brought out bound and gagged. In fact, there was pandemonium in the room. All the defendants were leaping out of their chairs, yelling, denouncing the judge, calling him a fascist. The audience in the court was yelling and screaming. The judge had 15 marshals kind of fighting with people. Most of the contempt citations, it turns out, against the 7 defendants and their 2 lawyers came from the way they responded to Bobby Seale being bound and gagged for 4 days. So Aaron Sorkin made the decision, instead of having pandemonium, outrage, and resistance, to make this a silent scene for us to experience ourselves. I mean, that's, I guess, his prerogative as the director, and it certainly is effective. It's not what it was like for the people who were there.
And what about
and Fred Hampton?
Yeah, Fred Hampton.
Yeah, Fred Hampton is usually left out of the story. Thank you very much for bringing him up. Fred Hampton was murdered by the Chicago police under circumstances even worse than described in the movie. In the movie, they have Bobby Seale saying he was shot first in the shoulder and therefore was unable to lift up his arm to shoot at the police, so there couldn't have been a shootout. In fact, he was shot while he slept. He was shot in his bed. He was shot twice in the head while he was sleeping in his bed. This was confirmed by the forensics after, the photos and the police misconduct hearings were underway. So it's much worse, actually, than Aaron Sorkin made it seem. I don't quite know why he did it that way. But yeah, it's a very important thing to put this in the trial. He was one of the Panthers' most promising, articulate, and not crazy people, unlike Huey Newton, who was a kind of what should we say, psychopathic criminal as well as a charismatic political leader.
Is there? I mean, do you think that obviously it's a movie that made the choices that it made. I mean, is your feeling as someone who lived through the politics of his time and who has studied it, professionally, do you think it mostly did justice to the politics of the time, in particular to the movement politics? I mean, not so much in terms of the detail, but in terms of the kind of the spirit and the ethos and the mood of it.
Well, what Aaron Sorkin is most interested in is the realism of the police beating people in Grant Park. And he's very proud of the fact that they shot on location in Grant Park with all of these extras so that they could match their footage with the newsreel footage of the time and the TV news footage. There's only a couple of brief moments where this actually happens, but he considers one of the greatest achievements is the realism of those scenes of the police attacking the demonstrators. And I think it does come through. Police are clubbing people right and left and mercilessly, and blood everywhere. That's not exactly the politics of the event or the spirit of the times, which are much harder to convey. As you said, a lot of that would have come through if they brought all these other witnesses who the defense presented in the courtroom to try to convey the spirit of the times, how broad the radical culture was of that era. And the fact that they don't really talk about the organizing aspect of the fact that, Rennie Davis in particular is treated very badly. He's this nerdy guy I guess it's because he wears glasses. Tony, you and I wear glasses. I guess from Aaron Sorkin's point of view, the nerdy guy is the one who wears glasses and who doesn't want his girlfriend's parents to find out that he's a radical. Right. The real Rennie Davis was the New Left's most talented organizer. As I said, he'd organized demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people. He'd been to North Vietnam. He'd brought home POWs. He'd been at this for a long time. He'd been a community organizer in Chicago. That whole dimension that these people had spent years organizing, both in communities and these mass protests, that's almost completely missing. And what we get is the police brutally attacked the young people who came to protest the war. Well, that's true.
I wanted to mention also, I didn't get to this enough in my review, and a couple of the people here have brought it up. But one thing that is, I guess there are two layers of this. First of all, Aaron Sorkin does have a bit of a woman problem as a writer and a director. There
are women in this. Let us say
there are women in this. Well, there are always women. There are always women who are usually there to listen to what men have to say, and then to sleep with them,
or try to seduce them when they're actually undercover cops.
Or try to.
That's the role of the.
Yeah, that's the greatest whole cloth invention in this movie is the FBI special agent who seduces Jerry Rubin
and breaks his heart.
Yes, but so I wanted to kind of mention that and get your thoughts on that, but also to get you to think, to talk a little bit about the status of women, the role of women within the movement. I think, in some ways rather notorious chauvinism of a lot of the leaders and the rank and file in the movement. The way the way I always heard the story told was that the feminism of the 70s partly arose from just the utter piggishness of the men in the New Left.
Yes,
in the 60s.
I
mean, do you think and the movie, of course, doesn't get into that, but I wondered if you could say something about both the sort of the role of women in the history and also in the movie, whether it's the same sexism or different.
I mean, this is a story about men, and I think the movie accurately portrays the fact that all of the people in this trial were men, and that the women were answering the phones and supporting men.
And burning their bras in
Women,
Grant
of course,
Park.
played a. Oh, there's one scene. Yes, there's one scene where they're burning their bras in Grant Park. This is taken from Atlantic City in 1964, transposed. But everyone knows what bra burners means, and Aaron Sorkin thought we should know that there's bra burners in Grant Park. Pretty unlikely. Women were always part, especially of the civil rights movement, the direct action movement in the South, the sit-ins. Voter registration work. In fact, some of the founders of what we call the Women's Liberation Movement began as activists in the civil rights movement, as community organizers. The SDS was an organization led by men, with a couple of notable exceptions, Bernardine Dohrn being the most prominent one. But yes, you're absolutely right that the Women's Liberation Movement arose partly as a critique of, protest against, and need to separate from the macho men of the New Left. And one of the most striking things about the current wave of gigantic protests, the Black Lives Matter protest that involved millions of people in America over the past summer, without the kind of internal feuding and ego trips that we saw in the New Left, or splits in organizations that we saw in the New Left, Black Lives Matter is led by women. And I think this may help explain, a lot of people think this helps explain why they are so much better at doing this than Abbie and Jerry and Tom and Rennie and so on.
Well, I mean, it is a fascinating, aspect of the New Left, that the one thing, or one of the major things about American society and American politics and the way that America is organized, that the New Left does not challenge until the Women's Liberation Movement in the 70s, is the assumption that white men will be in charge of it.
Right.
Just a different, sort of a different group of them. It's that, and it is remarkable to look at this movie. That is the thing that makes this feel most like a period piece, is that you could not make a movement about radical politics currently or in the recent past that would have that kind of a cast, and that would rest on those kind of assumptions. Which is, I mean, another thing I think about the Sorkin approach to political theater is that it depends, it's about the charisma of leaders. It's about, who steps up and makes the speech and kind of says the thing and gives voice to what needs to be said. And it's not, I mean, you say it's not about the work of organizing. And it's also not about the people who are doing that work, other than this sort of group of charismatic leaders. And even the way, as you say, it's kind of selects among them. So it's Tom Hayden and Abbie Hoffman, but it's not Rennie Davis or David Dellinger, a fascinating figure who's there sort of as a little bit of a joke. He's a pacifist, and then he throws a punch at a marshal in the courtroom.
And again, people want to know, did Dave Dellinger really throw a punch? The answer is simple. No, Dave Dellinger never did this. He did get his bail revoked, but that was for yelling bullshit at the testimony of one of the Chicago police officials, even though the only legal basis for revoking a person's bail is risk of flight. And there was no question that Dave Dellinger was going to stick in with this trial and, speak truth to power. So that was another one of the great injustices done to Dave Dellinger. But I don't understand why Aaron Sorkin wants him to throw a punch. I mean, where does this get you? Even pacifists can get mad. Is that an important thing for us to understand?
I think that's it. It's sort of that everyone is also the opposite. It's sort of the uptight government guy, has some sympathy with Abbie Hoffman, the old and the young, the hip and the square. In the end, we're all kind of in the same place. Also, that's pure television writing. That's like, here's a guy. Who's this guy? He's the pacifist. He never fights. He's nonviolent. He doesn't fight. What's going to happen? He's going to throw a punch.
You understand
kind of irony. Yeah. I mean, it's almost something you could see coming. Like if you were inventing this character, if you were making this as pure fiction, you'd say, okay, who's this guy? Oh, he's a pacifist. What's he gonna do? He's gonna punch out the marshal.
Fantastic. Can we say just a few words about how great Mark Rylance is? I've been rewatching Wolf Hall, where he plays another lawyer, Thomas Cromwell. This is Sir Mark Rylance, one of the great Shakespearean actors of our time, who comes to America and plays Bill Kunstler. He's a big leftist, it turns out, so he was excited and happy to have this part. But it's a wonderful thing to have him in this film.
For me, his was the performance of the film. I just really liked. I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's who Bill Kunstler was. I mean, I always thought of him as because he plays him as a very kind of almost sort of tortured intellectual. There's something kind of professorial and a little melancholy about him. But what I love about Mike Rylance as an actor and about this performance is that you always get a sense of a mind working and that there's more going on than is being said or expressed. So what you get the feeling that he's doing what a lawyer would do, which is calculating at every point, every time something new happens, sort of reformulating the strategy and thinking about the tactics. And then I also love the way he's just kind of flabbergasted by what the judge is doing. I mean, even he who has presumably seen, plenty of the system at its worst is just kind of dumbfounded that this judge can do these completely arbitrary and capricious and just utterly insane things. Yes, let's look.
We go to questions. Do we have any questions from our audience?
Let's see.
This is.
Oh yes, there's a lot of questions and a lot of good annotations and comments. This is a question I thought was really interesting that can sort of take us more into the real history a little bit and to the subsequent lives of these characters, which is about Tom Hayden. Tad says, of course you guys are right that Tom Hayden wasn't some dull moderate Democrat. He wanted to radicalize the Democratic Party. You might see him as a precursor to Dennis Kucinich and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, but his political career stalled at the California State Senate. Why? Why did he not become the Bernie Sanders of the 70s and 80s?
Whoa, that's a bit stepping outside. He well, he was a very
on the spot.
To be in the California legislature is actually quite a big deal, since California is got the 8th biggest economy in the world and is run by Democrats. So he ran for mayor. He was defeated for mayor. That was what happened. And California's senators are sort of served for life. May I point out Dianne Feinstein? How old is she? She still hasn't. I think she was there in Tom's day, and she still hasn't stepped down. So you wait your turn, and after he was defeated for mayor, it was a terrible, and he stepped out of party politics and devoted himself to other activities. But the Democratic Party at the time of the movie 1968 had this one possible opening, which I've mentioned, the Bobby Kennedy, but that was a very unlikely thing. It was very unlikely that Kennedy would even have agreed to run. Tom says he helped persuade Bobby Kennedy in 1968 to enter the race. And it was very unlikely that there was going to be a candidate who could, who it looked like was going to bring together the white working class and people of color. And since then, we haven't had a candidate who it seemed was going to succeed at that the way Bobby Kennedy did. Of course, this has all been romanticized hopelessly by subsequent history, and who knows really what might have happened. But you know, it was Bernie Sanders who transformed the Democratic Party by showing you could run as a socialist. I mean, Bobby Kennedy was never going to be a socialist. He was a liberal Democrat, and he wasn't that much against. He wasn't for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. He was for a negotiated end of the war, which is sort of what everybody, you know, that was even what Johnson and Humphrey said they were for at the time.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because going back to what you said before about the sort of the sense of the happy ending and the note of kind of, you know, triumph and resolve that comes at the end. And yes, you know, they're all convicted, but then you learn that their sentences were overturned on appeal. And there's this sort of moment, a sense that they and what they represent has won. But of course, in American politics, that's not where the story goes. Right? You have, you know, Nixon wins in 72 in a landslide, precisely brings a lot of the white working class over into the Republican Party, which Reagan will later consolidate. You have a decade of you know, and more of rolling back civil rights and women's rights and the redrawing of the map of American politics substantially to the right of where it had been in the 1960s. So it's just it's strange because you almost think that, like, well, what does Sorkin do with that? You know, like what? How do you reconcile? I mean, of course, he created the fantasy of liberal politics, you know, to get everyone through the Bush era by pretending that Martin Sheen was actually president. So, but that was a strange moment to me because I thought this is not. It may, you know, maybe people felt like that, but the real narrative is going in another direction.
Absolutely. You know, Sorkin did make a couple of other movies that the best of which were different from The West Wing, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah. No. I mean, I mean, I like him generally as a writer more than a director. I don't think he's a great cinema artist, let's say. I mean, there's just, you know, mentioning Spielberg, what Spielberg can do even with a talky script is give it a kind of visual energy and momentum that Sorkin can't quite do. But yes, no, I mean the you know, The Social Network and Moneyball. I mean, he's definitely gone into some in some interesting directions. It's not all that, but it is somehow when he gets into, you know, a place like a courtroom or a sort of a space where political theater of a certain kind is happening, a certain kind of rhetoric is gonna. I mean, that was true. That was the problem with the newsroom too. It's just, you know, people like.
So how come this is the most popular movie in America? How come 93% of the 160 critics who've written about it have given a thumbs up? You know, given all the limitations, weaknesses, flaws, and terrible parts that you and I have mentioned here.
Well, okay. First of all, I just wanted, without getting too deep into the technical film critic, I mean, Rotten Tomatoes is not the necessarily the best metric, but it is true that it's gotten a lot of good reviews, but one of the reasons is that, just, you know, this year being what it is, not a lot of movies have come out, and not a lot of kind of big feeling movies like this. Like we're looking at a very strange Oscar season. I mean, normally you would have a lot of sort of serious, ambitious, grown-up dramas with good actors in them, kind of coming out, and they would have come out in theaters in the spring, and then in the fall, you know, they would be at the Toronto Film Festival, the New York Film Festival, and they would be coming out in theaters, and those kinds of movies, which are very popular among critics and satisfy, you know, a sort of a desire to be writing about and embracing things that are serious, but aren't necessarily too esoteric or weird or abstract. So this is like just one of the very few kind of bona fide middlebrow movies that we've had. And so critics have just been, you know, starving for this all year. We've been streaming documentaries, we've been like watching TV shows, you know, I've been writing about like 50-year-old Italian movies for the Times, which I love, but it's sort of like, you know, if you're a mainstream film critic in America, like this movie, this is your job, this movie. And so I think there's a little bit of overrating it in a way, because it's like, you know, it's not a stupid movie. It's got some good acting in it. It's about something real, you know, not just factual, but important. It's about politics. It's about America. It's about all of these things. So I think I think in a way that a lot, speaking for all of my colleagues, except for myself, our guard was down. We were very susceptible to it.
And I wonder about the whole Netflix experience of watching this at home during the pandemic and having such a rousing experience it's so intense and then such a satisfying, happy ending. If that isn't something that we appreciate, especially in this time of troubles.
I think so. I mean, I think that it is in whatever vague or inauthentic a way, the fact that it is hopeful, and I'm not even sure what in a way the content of its hope is, except that you say it's a happy ending because, you know, it's dramatized in a certain way, it's presented in a certain way, and you see, you know, Tom Hayden completing his fake journey to and you know, and you hear the sort of the names of the dead written out. That has some power too, you know, at a time when there are a lot of unacknowledged dead whose names are not being memorialized. So it's dealing with a lot of meanings and resonances that are quite powerful, and the fact that it's put into this package that is also very entertaining. Like it's also a fun movie. It's funny. You know, Sasha Baron Cohen is in it. There's kind of like crazy 60s hippies in it. You know, they're smoking weed and you know, flipping off the judge. And it's like there's fun stuff too. So it can give you, I think, without making you work too hard or to feel really at all uncomfortable about anything. It can give you a little sort of a little package of American history.
You know, some of my left-wing friends who are deeply critical of the politics of Aaron Sorkin still say they kind of like this movie, and I think it's like a guilty pleasure, even for old leftists.
I'm glad to hear that, because I was curious about that too. You know, just watching it as someone of a different generation, and of, you know, of as a matter of company policy, no political views whatsoever. Right. I was wondering how, you know, how some people who had been there and seen it might think about it. Again, that's not, you know, that's not dispositive. I remember having big arguments with older friends of mine who had been around the Greenwich Village folk music scene about how inaccurate Inside Llewyn Davis was, you know, and how it had nothing to do with Dave Van Ronk or any of that, but a movie that's one of my very favorites of the last decade. So it's, but I'm glad to hear. I'm glad, actually, it makes me like the movie a little better and appreciate it a little more. Because my own feeling about it while I was watching it and writing about it was, well, I didn't think it was a very good movie. It did some things that I did appreciate, and I think you've articulated those very well.
It's not really a very good movie, but somehow it sticks with you. And so we're still talking about it here, weeks after you wrote your piece.
Yes. But what everyone should really do, if they haven't already, is if they want, because this is, talk about entertainment. You could just read, I would love to have actors just table read the transcripts. In a way, screenwriting is superfluous when you have. There are parts that just kind of crack you up, and there are a few lines you see that he did that Sorkin did take. There are a few things, especially that Abbie Hoffman says that are preserved from the record. But it's just really fun to read, a couple hundred pages of it with
Thank you for plugging the book. Let me just quote in closing here, where they could have ended the movie. They wanted to end with Abbie Hoffman. When Abbie Hoffman is sentenced, everybody, they didn't just pick Tom Hayden to give to respond. Everybody got a chance to talk in response to their sentence. And the judge sentences Abbie Hoffman to the same as everybody else, 5 years in jail and a $5,000 fine. And Abbie says, $5,000? Judge, could we make it $350? Those are my closing thoughts here.
That's excellent. And again, speaking of money, it won't even cost you that. Order it through McNally Jackson Bookstore, a great New York institution. One of the things that keeps New York a vibrant cultural place. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Maris and McNally.
Thank you.
And it's great to see you, John. It's just always so much fun to talk to you.
Tony, thanks a million for doing this. And Maris, thank you and to McNally Jackson for hosting this.
Such a pleasure. Buy books, everyone. Thanks.
Good night.